Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Gay Revolution, The Story of the Struggle by Lillian Faderman. Narrated by Donna Postel. Prologue. On the morning of May 26, 1948, Professor E.K. Johnston was standing at the rostrum in a University of Missouri auditorium. The annual awards ceremony for the School of Journalism was in full swing. Best columnist, best sports writer, best feature writer. Each award winner was called up to the stage, where Professor Johnston shook his hand and said kind and appropriate words as he bestowed a trophy of recognition. The professor had been on the University of Missouri faculty since 1924 and was now 50 years old, a man distinguished and comfortable in middle age, dressed formally in a light summer suit, spectacles balanced low on the bridge of his nose. Professor Johnston had taken a place of honor on that stage because that academic year he'd served as acting dean of the School of Journalism. The elderly permanent dean, Frank Mott, had been on leave, and Professor Johnston was an apt choice as his temporary replacement. E.K. Johnston was a full professor. He was much loved and respected by students and colleagues alike, and he had a national reputation as a multi-term president of a professional fraternity for those working in the relatively new discipline of the science of newspaper advertising. Indeed, it was assumed by many at the University of Missouri that when the present dean retired, Professor Johnston would be named his permanent successor. But as Professor Johnston was fulfilling his academic duties by shaking hands and wishing the aspiring young journalists continued success, he knew there was a warrant out for his arrest, issued by the county prosecutor. He suspected, too, that the charge against him was commission of sodomy. But for the moment, he wanted only to get through the awards ceremony, to fulfill his last duty of the academic year to the students in his charge. And he did. When the ceremony was over, Professor Johnston drove himself downtown, walked into the county prosecutor's office, and gave himself up. At his arraignment, he pleaded innocent. Thrown into the Boone County Jail until he could raise bail, he spent 2 days behind bars. The county prosecutor, Howard Lang, had started the investigation 6 months earlier. There'd been a robbery, and a man was apprehended and brought in for questioning. It was he, Prosecutor Lang told the newspapers, who talked about a homosexual ring there in Columbia, Missouri, that carried on sex orgies. As happened often during police interrogations of homosexuals in the mid-20th century, police detectives grilled the robber until he named names. One of the names was Willie Coots, a 39-year-old gift shop employee. Coots was then brought in and was made to name more names. Each man that Willie Coots named was dragged in for questioning and grilled. A police department secretary took down in shorthand what each arrestee said, and she compiled a list of 30 names. Of all the men Coots named, the most interesting to the Columbia police, because of his prominence, was Professor E.K. Johnston. Coots confessed that he and the professor had lived together for 10 years as lovers, and for the last 6 years as friends. The police wanted more facts. Had he and Johnston held homosexual parties in their shared apartment? Yes, they had. More names, other homosexuals who'd had illegal congress with Johnston. Yes, he did remember some. Just a few days earlier, there was a man named Warren Heathman. Heathman was a 35-year-old World War II veteran who had fought overseas. He'd earned a master's degree in agriculture from the University of Missouri and was now an instructor for the Veterans Administration's farm training program. Heathman could not be found at his home address, so the Columbia police sent out an all-points bulletin for his arrest. He was picked up by state highway patrolmen in Rolla, Missouri, about 2 hours away, and locked up overnight in Jefferson City's Cole County Jail. In the morning, patrolmen shackled him and drove him to the jail in Columbia, and he too was grilled. This was serious business, they told him. Perjury is a felony for which he could be incarcerated for 5 years. Willie Coots had mentioned a big fish, a professor at the university. Did Heathman know E.K. Johnston? When had he last seen him? Where? Heathman, disoriented and scared, did not take long to answer every question they threw at him. Yes, he and Johnston engaged in homosexual activities. Yes, on an average of every other week. Yes, usually in Johnston's apartment. Yes, he'd been to homosexual parties, not only in that same apartment, but also at a cabin near Salem, Missouri. Mad parties of a homosexual cabal, the newspapers would report. Just as Willie Coots had done, Heathman signed a statement implicating Johnston as the leader of the homosexual ring. Heathman and Coots both waived their preliminary hearings. They did not want to drag out their ordeal. Because neither one was the supposed kingpin of the homosexual ring, their bail was set at $2,500 apiece, $1,000 lower than Johnston's. The professor, however, was not as easily intimidated. He had gone himself to the police station and demanded to know why there was a warrant out for his arrest. When police detectives took him into a room to interrogate him, he knew his rights. He would say nothing to his inquisitors, except, "I want to talk to my lawyer." He was permitted to call his attorney, Edwin Orr, who advised him not to sign any statement and not to waive his preliminary hearing. From the Boone County Jail, he contacted his half-brother in Kansas City and a friend in Sedalia, Missouri, and borrowed money for the $3,500 bond. In their coverage of the story, local newspapers were sure to name both Howard Johnston, the brother, and Fred Hildebrand, the friend, shaming them for having aided and abetted a homosexual. Family newspapers within a 1,000-mile radius of Columbia all seemed to pick up the story, which was covered by the wire services of the Associated Press, as well as the United Press International. The local papers embellished their articles with sensational headlines. Missouri professor held for sodomy, termed principal in homosexual ring, was the Pottstown, Pennsylvania Mercury headline. The headline in Arkansas's Hope Star was simply homosexual, which was shocking enough all by itself in 1948. It was not until his temporary release from jail that Johnston learned that he'd been found guilty even before he was tried. In view of the nature and gravity of the charges that have been made against Professor E.K. Johnston, the president of the university, Frederick Middlebush, told reporters, he has been relieved of his duties as a member of the university. Hysteria spread. The superintendent of the State Highway Patrol, Colonel Hugh Wagoner, announced not only to the university's board of curators, but also to the media, that Johnston was only the tip of the iceberg. The board of curators panicked. Alan McReynolds, its president, immediately called a press conference to promise the public the board will take such action as it deems necessary to protect the interests of the university. McReynolds added defensively that homosexuals were a public problem and one that ought to be solved. Missouri's governor, Phil Donnelly, weighed in, assuring Missourians that he had ordered the president of the Board of Curators to confer with State Highway Patrol officials about the homosexuals they'd discovered, and to make sure such people had no place on the university's faculty or among the student body. On November 17th, Johnston stood before Judge W.M. Dinwiddie of the Boone County Circuit Court. Johnston's lawyer, Edwin Orr, had advised him that the prosecutor held in his hands multiple signed statements. He must throw himself at the mercy of the court. Johnston must have struggled to resign himself to this. How could he relinquish into perpetuity the image of the man he once was? How could he claim as his the character of a criminal? Orr promised that he would call witnesses who would talk about Johnston's good character, and plead for clemency. The witnesses would tell the judge there was no point in sending a man like Johnston to jail. The ex-professor was by now emotionally and physically exhausted. He'd lost his job, his good name, his beloved students, his entire career, even his pension. He was 50 years old. What would he live on for the rest of his life? He had no more fight left in him. And if he did not confess to the world of being guilty of sodomy and then throw himself at Judge Dinwiddie's mercy, he would be locked in jail for who knew how many years to come. Johnston pleaded guilty and did not open his mouth again for the rest of the trial. The principal witness for the defense was Dr. Edward Gilday, head of the Department of Psychiatry at Washington University in St. Louis. Asked whether E.K. Johnston would be a menace to society if he were placed on probation, the psychiatrist said no, though in my judgment he is a homosexual. He was followed by a long line of character witnesses. Each confirmed that Johnston had been widely respected and liked, that a penitentiary sentence would not help him nor serve society, that he could be turned free without detriment to society. The pleas for clemency were not without effect. Judge Dinwiddie wouldn't send the defendant to jail, he announced. He'd put him on probation for 4 years. Johnston must have felt a surge of relief, even joy. But the judge was not through. Johnston was required to post a $2,000 bond. It was his obligation to pay all court costs. Judge Dinwiddie ordered him to report regularly to Wayne Ballard, the state probation officer. Finally, Judge Dinwiddie concluded, "Your order of probation includes your cessation of all homosexual practices." There's a women's memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. It was erected in 1997 to honor the 2 million women who have served in the American military, past and present. It sits on the grand 4-acre ceremonial entrance, and its elegant structure, with its lofty classical design and its arched ceiling made of glass tablets, is worthy of the solemn site. There's also an auditorium at the Women's Memorial, where ceremonies are held to recognize the outstanding achievements of female military personnel. In that auditorium, Army Colonel Tammy Smith was pinned with 2 stars, one on each epaulette, making official her promotion to Brigadier General. A ceremony that celebrates a woman's rise to the rank of general is certainly rare, though not unheard of. There'd already been about 50 women generals or admirals serving in the U.S. military. But the auditorium of the Women's Memorial had never yet seen quite such a ceremony as the one that took place on August 10th, 2012. At 4 o'clock, as a soloist sang the Star-Spangled Banner, Smith, a short, slight, bespectacled woman who'd once been a senior parachutist and an airplane jump master, marched onto the stage together with her commanding officer, Major General Jack Stoltz. Media cameras rolled and clicked. In General Stoltz's ceremonial remarks, he talked about why Smith had been promoted to her elevated position. She'd racked up a fruit salad of medals in her distinguished 26 years of service in the Army, which included a stint in Afghanistan as Chief of Army Reserve Affairs. General Stoltz praised the values she epitomized and her ability as a leader. "She is," he said, "a quiet professional who just knows how to come in and take over." Then the general introduced the guests of honor. First, Smith's elderly father, and then her spouse and her in-laws. Traditionally, the stars on a new general's epaulettes are pinned by the 2 individuals most meaningful to that person. Smith stood at attention while her father pinned on one side and her spouse pinned on the other. Her in-laws, too, had an official role in the ceremony. They were chosen to remove the colonel's shoulder boards from Smith's uniform and replace them with a general's shoulder boards. Next, father and spouse unfurled a flag, red with a white star, which is to be flown wherever Smith will be stationed to announce that a general is present. There was little about this traditional ceremony that was unique, except that the spouse, Tracy Hepner, was a woman. It was a brave act, not because Smith might be in danger of discharge or losing her new rank, but because never before in the entire history of the U.S. military had it been done. Smith had told General Stoltz well in advance that she wanted her wife to be part of the pinning ceremony. He didn't blink an eye, she recalled, nor did the Department of Defense. "This is your story. It's a good story. Don't be afraid to tell it," DoD officials said in encouraging her to respond to media requests for interviews about the inclusion of her wife in her promotion ceremony. "Tell them why it's important to have Tracy pin your star. Tell them what it means to you." What it meant, General Smith told the media, was that finally, with the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, she was able to feel full, authentic, and complete by no longer having to keep secret who she was. She had no desire to grandstand, to make political coming-out declarations. Her wife's prominent role in the ceremony was Smith's clear and simple statement that, "This is my family." Since Don't Ask, Don't Tell has been overturned, sexual orientation is considered a private matter by the Department of Defense. It's a private matter for General Smith as well. But, she said, participating with family in traditional ceremonies, such as the pinning ceremony, is both common and expected of a leader. By including her wife, she was doing no more and no less than what military leaders have always done at such ceremonies. What long-fought battles, tragic losses, and hard-won triumphs have brought us as a country from the days when a much-loved and gifted professor could be disgraced, thrown in jail, and hounded out of his profession as soon as his private life was revealed, to the days when a military officer could marry the woman she loves in broad daylight and be promoted in a very public ceremony to the rank of general with her wife by her side. How does the amazing evolution in image and status of gays and lesbians, as well as bisexual and transgender people, affect all Americans? And what remains to be done before they will truly be first-class American citizens? These are the stories the gay revolution will tell. A brief history of changing terminology. To 19th-century sexologists, such as Richard von Krafft-Ebing and Havelock Ellis, men and women who were attracted sexually to the same sex, and those whose gender identity didn't match their anatomical sex, were all sexual inverts. In the 20th century, the sexologists' conflation of sexual orientation and gender identity was reflected in popular culture. For instance, the protagonist of Radcliffe Hall's 1928 novel The Well of Loneliness, Stephen Gordon, who'd be considered transgender in our day, became the most famous fictional lesbian of the era. Homosexual, another umbrella term coined by the sexologists in the 19th century, came into popular use in the 20th century. It, too, made no distinctions, though in Argot all effeminate male homosexuals were called queens, masculine female homosexuals were called butches, regardless of the degree of their male gender identity. Mid-century civil rights organizations, wanting to take the emphasis off the sexual of homosexual, coined the term homophile. Gay became an underground synonym for homosexual in the early 20th century, encompassing men who were attracted to men, lesbians, people who'd later be called transgender, and bisexuals when they were acting homosexually. The first literary use of gay appeared in Gertrude Stein's short story Miss Fur and Miss Skeen, written in 1908, about the tumultuous lesbian relationship between two of her acquaintances, Ethel Mars and Maud Hunt Squire. When Stein published the story in Vanity Fair in 1922, few readers would have known the underground meaning of gay, though homosexuals active in the burgeoning subculture would have recognized that Stein's story, which plays with the word gay throughout, was an in-joke. The Stonewall generation, which preferred to describe itself as gay, brought the term from the underground into popular consciousness in the 1970s. About the same time, feminism prompted women who were sexually attracted to other women to distinguish themselves from male counterparts by bringing into popular use the term lesbian, from Lesbos, birthplace of Sappho. As the movement for civil rights grew in the 1980s, gay and lesbian became practically one word, which was also intended to imply transgender people. The term transgender had been in occasional use since the 1970s. In the 1990s, queer was becoming the term of choice for many young people. In the late 1990s, the acronym LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, came into use, as did LGBTQ, though gay and lesbian remained the most frequent descriptor and was meant to be inclusive into the 21st century. With the growing visibility of transgender people and the increasing willingness of bisexuals to identify themselves, LGBT became a popular term by the second decade of the 21st century. Other groups in demanding recognition have stretched the acronym as far as LGBTQIAAP, which also includes questioning, intersex, asexual, allies, and pansexual. I've chosen to call this book The Gay Revolution because gay is still most widely understood as an umbrella term for a diverse community. However, in aiming for historical precision, I've tried to use the terms that were most current in each era I depict, whether homosexual, homophile, gay, lesbian, lesbian feminist, gay and lesbian, LGBT, and so on. Part 1. Scapegoats. Chapter 1. Lawbreakers and Loonies. Homosexualist psychopathic individuals. Dr. Carlton Simon was an enlightened man. Though Special Deputy Police Commissioner for New York State since 1920, he opposed the death penalty, and he advocated the rehabilitation of criminals. He opened a psychiatric clinic to serve the mentally disturbed down and out of the Bowery, and he disputed the use of the water cure, a torture technique devised by the U.S. Army to interrogate prisoners during the occupation of the Philippines in World War II. He was a star among law enforcement officials and the medical establishment, and among society's upper crust, too. But Dr. Simon had his idiosyncrasies and prejudices. The bald, hulking doctor dabbled in phrenology. He assured his formidable audiences, including the New York Academy of Medicine and the New York State Association of Chiefs of Police, that a criminal could be identified, even before he committed a crime, by a drooping eyelid or a hanging corner of the mouth. Simon was also an expert on race. Negro criminals, he opined, were dishonest, shiftless, and unreliable. His 1947 lecture to the International Association of Chiefs of Police on homosexualists and sex crimes, a model of bigotry and flawed logic, passed for science that lay people accepted uncritically. The born male homosexualists, he asserted, are easy to spot by their female characteristics, their walk, body contour, voice, mannerisms, texture of skin, and also their interest in housekeeping and theatrical productions. The women homosexualists are fickle, always eager to add to their list of conquests, and are extremely jealous of the object of their lusts. Though Simon granted that some homosexualists live as decent members of society, many, he insisted, have psychopathic personalities, are indifferent to public opinion, and become predatory prostitutes. He extolled the state of Illinois' treatment of homosexualist psychopathic individuals, and recommended it be adopted everywhere. In Illinois, convicted homosexualists could be held as psychiatric prisoners until they recovered. If they recovered, they were then tried for having committed sodomy, which was punishable in that state by up to 10 years in prison. Dr. Simon had influential counterparts all over the country, such as Dr. Arthur Lewis Miller, a Nebraska physician who was state health director. From that position of authority, Dr. Miller disseminated his theory about the homosexuals' cycles of uncontrolled desire, which were as regular as women's menstrual cycles. 3 or 4 days in each month, the homosexual's instinct for moral decency breaks down, and he is driven into abnormal fields of sexual practice. Because the homosexual can't control himself, the doctor told the Nebraska State Medical Association, science must step in. Large doses of sedatives or other treatment were what Dr. Miller recommended to help the homosexual escape from performing acts of homosexuality. When Dr. Miller was elected to the U.S. Congress, he brought his ideas with him to Washington. As Congressman Miller, he authored a sexual psychopath law for the District of Columbia. The Miller Act, as it was called, passed both the House and the Senate without difficulty. It made sodomy punishable by up to 20 years in prison. It also mandated that anyone accused of sodomy, defined as either anal or oral sex, had to be examined by a psychiatric team. The psychiatrists would determine whether the accused was a sexual psychopath, one who, through repeated misconduct in sexual matters, had shown himself to be unable to control his sexual impulses. If a man were picked up several times by the D.C. police for cruising in Lafayette Park, for instance, the psychiatric team could diagnose him to be a sexual psychopath, and he could be committed to the criminal ward of the District of Columbia's St. Elizabeth's Psychiatric Hospital, even before being allowed his day in court. Under Section 207 of the bill, he would remain there until the superintendent of St. Elizabeth's finds that he has sufficiently recovered. The Senate Committee on the District of Columbia called the Miller Act a humane and practical approach to the problem of persons unable to control their sexual emotions. President Harry Truman signed Dr. Miller's bill into law in June 1948. 5 months earlier, Alfred Kinsey's Sexual Behavior in the Human Male had been published. No one who was reasonably informed could have escaped knowing about Kinsey's book because it was reviewed in every major newspaper and magazine in the country. Kinsey's name became a household word. He and his team had interviewed 5,300 men, asking each of them over 300 questions. The Kinsey study found that 46% of American males admitted that, as adults, they'd reacted sexually to both males and females. 37% admitted to having had at least one homosexual experience as an adult. 10% said that as adults they'd been more or less exclusively homosexual for at least 3 years. Even those who chose to believe that Kinsey's numbers were inflated had to admit the likelihood that vast numbers of the male population were having sex with other men. But in a stunning disconnect, lawmakers and the medical doctors who influenced them preferred to insist that people who engaged in such acts comprised a tiny, distinct group, different from the rest of humanity. These homosexuals were lawbreakers and loonies, and they must be controlled. Controlling the lawbreakers. About 10 o'clock on the evening of September 4th, 1959, Thomas Ferry, a strikingly well-built young man in tight jeans and a form-fitting T-shirt, walked into Tiger's, a beer and wine bar on Los Angeles' Sunset Strip. The routine wasn't new to him. He'd been in Tiger's 5 times in the last weeks. He sat down at the end of the long bar so that he could see the action, and he ordered a beer.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?